Hi and welcome back. This is Police Stories Podcasts and this is episode 48. This is a series of short stories about my 28-year career in the UK police force, or forces, as I moved around a bit, as some of you will be aware. Downloads great this week, thanks ever so much. Amazingly just hit 6,500 downloads in total, which is mind-boggling to me. I continue to be surprised at how well it's going, really, and just how many people are downloading it, so that's great, thank you. We're still on YouTube. I go out on YouTube every week as well with the same podcasts, and the only difference there, if you listen to it, is that you have the option of adding some comments or asking a question if there was something you wondered about. So by all means do that if you want to. So just stepping back briefly to last week, I was just finishing up on uniform patrol in South London in the Metropolitan Police. And if you remember, I'd applied for, I'd been turned down for sergeant, frustratingly, and I was a bit cheesed off with the whole thing. And I'd applied for the Marine unit based at Wapping on the River Thames, and had been successful, got through my board, and had been successful and had been accepted onto the unit, subject to passing some aptitude tests, because it's such a different environment to work in that there's various tests you have to do surrounding the work to make sure that you're suitable, and that you're going to be able to do the work, and also that you like it, because sometimes people did those tests and said, I didn't realise you did that, this just isn't for me. So some of those aptitude tests consisted of swim tests. There was a swim test where you had to do 6 lengths, I think it was 6 lengths of a 50-metre Olympic sized pool, and that was in police uniform and long sleeve shirt. I don't think there was a time limit on it. You just had to be able to complete those 6 lengths, and if you're a reasonably strong swimmer, that was doable. There was also a jump from a diving board that was 3 metres high. Not a massive height, but that was just to simulate, jumping into the water from a vessel if you had to. And again, that came later on in the training. And surprisingly to me, I didn't have an issue with it, but some people just didn't like it, and just couldn't jump from that board, or thought they were good swimmers and then got kind of halfway through the swim test. Because when you're wearing trousers and shirts, especially long sleeve shirts, it really drags you down, and it's not like you're wearing your Speedos and you're thrashing out lengths, sort of like you might do in the private world. It's very, very different, and there's a bit of a technique to it as well. You kind of don't really want to do full-on crawl, because each time you're dragging your arms on a front crawl out of the water that have got a long sleeve shirt on that's now soaked and heavy, really, really draining. So actually breaststroke, or even a sort of form of doggy paddle, actually a sort of side on doggy paddle, worked quite well. It saved your energy a bit, and it was certainly something that people that were serious had perhaps been into their local pool, and had tested before they came on the actual trial. So there was the swim test, there was the jumping test from the board, then we went on to do a ladder climb. That's really important, because there's lots of boarding ships ranging from small vessels that you'd virtually step aboard at the same height as you, right up to boarding full-on commercial 300-metre ships where you'll be climbing up a pilot's ladder that's at the side of those vessels. Those things can be 20 or 30 metres high, very energy sapping. And if you don't like those vessels are virtually always moving, so if you don't like heights and you're not comfortable around water, it's definitely not the job for you. And that was obviously an opportunity to give them a look at you, and vice versa, to see whether you thought you could do that. So we went to one of the side of one of the big buildings on the Thames and basically climbed up a ladder, and that was okay for me as well. I've always been pretty comfortable with heights. There was also an option to do a longer ladder climb up the side of the actual police station itself, based at Wapping, which is quite a high building. And also, if you wanted to, there was some abseiling available as well, because the Marine Policing Unit also provides people for searching at height. They're all trained, not all of them, some of them are trained climbers to a commercial level, and are able to abseil pretty much down anything. And that's for both searching at height, if you have to go and search roofs and things, but also they get heavily involved in protester removal. So when you have, you know, people that are protesting and they're hanging a banner off a crane or whatever, you know, that's 50 metres up, then they're the team that go and deal with that. So there was an opportunity to look at that as well. But I was successful, thankfully, for those. So I was accepted onto the unit. Now, the Marine Policing Unit has been called various things over the year and has quite an interesting history. Now, you might listen to what I'm going to say and say that's not interesting at all. It's boring, but I'm going to tell you anyway, because I'm a bit of an anorak, and I was always quite interested in the unit or the history of the unit. So it's claimed to be one of the oldest police forces, certainly in the UK, possibly the world. Now, there is a couple of disputes for that one, but it was actually set up in 1798 by a guy called Patrick Colquhoun. And what was happening was London and the Thames was, you know, one of the biggest ports, and certainly one of the busiest ports in the world at the time. And there was a huge amount of cargo coming into London daily. And what was happening is the merchant ships were coming in, but there just wasn't enough wharf space to unload all that cargo, or not sort of quickly and efficiently like they do now. So quite often the Thames would be absolutely full of these cargo vessels kind of strung out down the Thames, waiting for their slot to get alongside a wharf to be unloaded. Or the alternative was they would use someone called lightermen. Now the watermen and lightermen are still a thing on the Thames now, and people that work on the river, that's what they're called. Well, they were called lightermen at the time, and at the time they had you know, small rowing boats that they would very slowly unload the cargo off of these big sort of cargo ships, and then take it ashore and take it into the various wharves where it would presumably be, you know, tested or checked and, you know, sort of ticked off and seen what arrived. But unfortunately what was happening was the lightermen at the time, and I'm not going to comment on them nowadays, but were of dubious character, some of them, and lots of things were being stolen and going missing cargo wise. And bearing in mind we're talking about, you know, 1798, so quite a long time ago. They reckon that there was £500,000 worth of things going missing every year from the port. So the port, you know, needed to do something, and this Patrick Colquhoun decided that he got authority to set up this sort of policing unit, and initially started with just 12 staff, but he managed to turn it around quite quickly and show, you know, that them patrolling at night and in their sort of rowing boats at the time, it would have been just for those 12 staff, in 6 months he managed to reduce the losses to about £100,000 from £500,000. So it had a really good effect, and obviously from that he got extra funding to then grow that force. And that eventually went on to become the Marine Policing Unit as we know now. Although what happened was in 1829 the Metropolitan Police was formed by Sir Robert Peel, and then the Marine Policing Unit as it was then sort of merged into the Met. So they were set up, you know, some 30 odd years before the Met. However, there was one of the forerunners potentially, it was in 1749, and that was the Bow Street Runners. They were set up on land as well. And apparently there was possibly a Scottish force of some description in sort of 1611. You can tell I've been Googling, and it's just save you the bother if you're interested. But so there's a bit of dispute about who was the first, but certainly the Marine Policing Unit, it wasn't called that then, but, you know, as it is now, was very, very early days, 1798. So there's quite a lot of history there, and it, you know, it was a really interesting place to work. I loved it. I was there for 10 years in total and thoroughly enjoyed it, and we're going to talk about some of that now. So once you'd completed the aptitude test, and as I say, I was successful with that, you went on to then the training. So they didn't actually like, one of the things I was told on the interview process is kind of don't mention that you like boats or you're into boats. They don't want that. They'll tell you they want, you know, good coppers, they want police officers first. They can then train them to become boat handlers after that. And in fact, again, like, you know, taking on a soldier for a firearms unit, if you're taking on a sort of you know, somebody who does boating privately or is into boats, you know, out of the police, you've probably got a certain amount of bad habits to sort of break them out of first before you can reteach them in a way that's acceptable to the unit. So the first thing that you did was the 6-week day skipper course, or that's how it was run full time at the unit. They have in-house trainers that are trained up with the RYA, the Royal Yachting Association. That's a a British agency or area, but it's accepted pretty much worldwide, and I'm sure, again, I may not have that quite right, but certainly worldwide in boating and marine terms, the RYA is known pretty well. So they do loads of courses on all sorts of things, starting off from literally kind of a 1 day, 2 day input into introduction to boating. This is the front of the boat, it's the sharp end, this is the blunt end, and that's called the stern. Very, very basic stuff. But right up to, they'll give you the ability to skip effectively mini cruise ships virtually, depending on what level you take it to. 6-week RYA day skipper. That was like a Monday to Friday. And then as you got later on, obviously they bring in things like, sailing at night, all the navigation issues that come with that. That's split into 2 parts as well. There's a practical side of that, and there's also a navigational side, and they're 2 distinct parts. So throughout the week, you do maybe 4 days, I think it was, of the practical side of it and boat handling. And then there'd be 1 day dedicated solely to navigation stuff and working towards that day skipper theory exam at the end of the 6 weeks. Also throughout the course, as well as being out in the river and doing what we would call, bumping and grinding which is where you're practicing coming alongside with the boat. Obviously it's called that because it doesn't always go brilliantly. You have lots of big squishy sausage fenders out to try and prevent damage. But depending on how hard you hit the side when you were learning, there was sometimes a bit of damage incurred. Generally, it wasn't too bad. It was the odd scratch that'll probably cut out. We didn't sink any vessels, or not my course didn't, but that has happened. On one occasion, a course that was running tied up a vessel on the Friday evening alongside the pontoon at Wapping, went off for the weekend. When they came back, somebody said, "Where did you park the boat? Where did you berth the boat?" And I said, "Well, I tied it up there on the inside of that pontoon." And they were saying, "Well, it's not there now." And when they went down and the tide had gone out a little bit, there was just a single aerial sort of poking out of the water. And what had happened was, it was no one's fault, but basically a seacock, which is where the cooling water comes in for the engine, had failed and had flooded the boat. And it had happened gradually, and various people have been back and forward. And then don't forget that the boats, although they sort of work out of Wapping, and they still do today, they're gone for 12 hours a time, while they're out working. And while they're out, one of the vessels, this particular vessel, had sunk entirely, and ended up having to be recovered by the dive team. And of course the engine was ruined. It was no one's fault, it was just one of those things. Seacock had failed. But you can imagine, quite amusing, "Did you park the boat?" "I think so, I'll put it there." You can imagine the conversation. So that was quite amusing. So yes, my course didn't sink any boats, but yeah, it has happened for sure. So really, really interesting. And part of that 6 weeks, you didn't just get confined to the river. We went out to sea. There was some longer passages. Part of that course is you have to complete longer passages as a skipper. So there'd generally be 3 crew on a boat. Although for the purposes of the course, there'd probably be 4. So there'd be 3 of you on the course, and then there'd be an instructor as well. So yeah, really, really good fun, very interesting course. And obviously over those 6 weeks, you get the full range of weather, from lovely sunny days to horrendous rain and very strong winds. But all the time you were getting used to the boats and getting used to how they handled, and what they were capable of, really, and I suppose what you were capable of too. The instructors would deliberately put you in some very sticky situations with the tide. So the tides on the River Thames run very, very fast. At the peak spring tide, you could expect maybe 6 knots, which may not sound a lot. It's probably about 8 miles an hour. But on a boat, that can cause problems very, very quickly, particularly when you've got things like low bridges about, lots of commercial vessels going up and down the river constantly. They never stop day and night. And lots of fixed, posts and all sorts of back eddies and things that you have to learn. There's quite a lengthy, involved lesson and test eventually that goes on in terms of just navigating the river and knowing what all the different parts are called. A bit like a London cabbie has to do the sort of black cab knowledge. He does the knowledge test, which is hugely involved and takes them, normally a couple of years to learn. Exactly the same with the river. You eventually have a test where you have to sit down with the Port of London Authority and basically verbally talk through the entire length of the river. And it takes about 2 hours to go through it. And they expect you to know the name of every buoy, every reach, every mooring. And also specifically, they'll stop you and question you, okay, at this certain point here, what would you expect to happen on an ebb tide, which is the tide going out? And there's a couple of places on the river where, the tide never stops running, even though it should do every 6 hours. It doesn't necessarily. And also, generally, the tide runs for 6 hours in one direction, i.e. coming in, and then 6 hours going out. But again, there's certain places where, the tide only goes one direction. You say you get these back eddies where even when the tide is coming in certain points and weird little whirlpools and things, it's actually going out the other way. So you have to know that local knowledge. So you do this local knowledge test. And at the end of those 2 hours, you had to actually pass that test to be able to work on the river. So it took a good, year or so to work towards that, to know that knowledge. So within that course, we also did VHF tests, so that's very high frequency, so marine radio basically. That's a one-day course that gets thrown in. There's also a marine diesel course, so the basics. Now, Wapping also has a complete engineering team that work there as well, and they're the ones that regularly service the boats and look after the boats, any damage that's caused, fixing things, uprating things, dealing with, new boats. And don't forget, it's not just a boat, it's a police boat, so it has sirens and lights and all sorts of other things, lots of other electrics that are on it that can go wrong. So you have a full-time team there as well maintaining those boats. But certainly you did the marine diesel course. It gave you the basics, and enabled you to sort of diagnose real basic stuff and have some sort of working knowledge. Also, there was extra first aid. Unusually, firearms generally have sort of enhanced first aid training, for example, where they deal with oxygen and maybe putting lines into people, and certainly putting airways into people, where you're protecting their airway should they have, a heart attack or something. That's the same on the marine unit. There was enhanced training to deal with giving oxygen to people. Not many police are able to do that. And there's all sorts of inherent risks, particularly on boats with that, and also around defibrillators, because obviously defibrillators are all about starting people's hearts with a massive electric shock. Now, that doesn't mix very well with a wet environment, which is obviously what the river is. So there was lots of training around that as well. And actually, one of the first things you do if you recovered someone from the water was, if they were unconscious, not breathing, was hook them up to a defib. But you had to be extremely careful about how that was done when there was, pools of water about, the people were wet, and you were potentially kneeling in the big puddle of water, from the person you just hauled out the river. You've hooked them up to a defib. If you're about to shock them and you're kneeling in that water, and it's, X amount of 1,000 volts, then, you could be in trouble. So there's a lot of specific training around that. We also did firefighting training. And so that was another 2-day course that was sort of bolted on or within part of those initial 6 weeks. We went down to Gravesend, where there's a maritime college, and you had 2 days there where you were taught how to fight fires. You got to wear all the kit, and they trained you in dealing with sort of household fires as well. They showed you the sort of chip pan demonstration. That's always very interesting and certainly very impressive. But then it was very specific around boats, so you went on to deal with a fuel fire and deal with, what they call salvage pumps. So you basically have a pump that you could drop over the side that all the boats carried. That would then give you, a water hose to fight fires with, but at a very high rate of water. It wasn't a garden hose. It was quite a substantial piece of kit and could, put on thousands of gallons very, very quickly onto a fire. So you had training around that pump, and also how that would work in reality, of how to deal with it on an actual fire on board a ship. So that was really interesting 2 days, actually. I'd never really done anything like that, and I thoroughly enjoyed that. That was good. There's also a course in there, an RYA sea survival course, which is a 2-day course that was held at the same place at the college. So you did lots of training there around setting off flares, around life-saving equipment, They've got a pool there. I believe the RNLI use it as well, the British lifeboat. So there's a lot of testing there goes on with boats. We practice deploying a life raft, which is the big squishy sort of inflatable lifeboat effectively that you'd throw over the side if your vessel was sinking, or alternatively if another vessel was sinking that didn't have one, you might throw your own over to be able to pass it to somebody who was perhaps already in the water, or if their vessel was sinking. So there's a lot of work done around that. Again, there was things about signalling ships, and once again you were back in the pool, then a life raft was deployed within that pool and you had to practice getting in and out of that life raft, which is actually surprisingly difficult to do, particularly if you weren't, you know, very strong or fit. And lots of people go through this training. So while we were there, it was a fairly mixed group. We had people that work on cruise ships coming in, people that worked on commercial ships, people that worked on ferries coming in to do the same training as us, because that's all sort of the basic you know, RYA sea survival course that you do. Really good course. Again, they talk about, you know, radios on it, as I say, flares. It covers some first aid. Once again, you had to jump in from height. You had to show that you were happy to jump in from a 3-meter board, which we'd already done as part of the aptitude test. But again, you know, some sort of civilians that had, you know, never worked on a cruise ship or whatever really struggled with that, and a couple weren't able to do it. You know, they couldn't jump from height into water. They just didn't like it. So unfortunately, they weren't able to pass that course. But yeah, really, really fun course again, with a very serious undertone, you know, because you know, you could find yourself, in fact, for sure, I found myself having to use all these pieces of equipment, and they had you in the water in a life jacket, which again, it sounds basic and straightforward, but a lot of people, you know, have never done that before. And you know, when you're in the water in a life jacket, there's a specific way of putting it on. There's certain things you can do that make it easier and more comfortable, and certainly safer. So for example, if you just put a life jacket over your head, if you jump in the water and the straps aren't done up properly, it's just going to pop off over your head. And also, the tendency is that it doesn't help keep your legs up. However, a lot of life jackets have crutch straps that go under your legs and in between your legs. If you attach them in the correct way, it's a lot comfier and a lot safer, and it actually helps support your body out of the water. And a life jacket is designed to roll you on your back and keep your head and mouth out of the water, whereas a buoyancy aid that you might see somebody wearing, you know, if they were out on a boat, if they were, you know, perhaps water skiing or using, you know, one of those donuts or something being towed behind a boat, a buoyancy aid will only keep you afloat. But if you fall in the water and you end up face down, it won't turn you over. A life jacket, a correctly worn life jacket that's attached in the right way, is guaranteed to roll you on your back and keep your head and mouth clear of the water. So obviously vital. But again, we got to try out some different, you know, buoyancy aids, life jackets. We fired some flares. We practiced getting in and out of life rafts. And there's a certain amount of theory as well. So very, very enjoyable two-day course. So that was good. So I thoroughly enjoyed my 6 weeks. It culminates in you end up with 2 or 3 days away, because again, you have to do long night passages. There's also some navigation tests to do where you have to just use a compass, for example, or it's down to you to work out on a nautical chart. They will tell you are currently here, and you might be in the river, but in the estuary, right down effectively at sea. This is your current location. I want you to navigate me to this buoy over here. And it's an unlit buoy, and it's at night, in the dead of night. Invariably, if you're unlucky, there'll be no moon either, so it really is pitch black out there. And you've got a series of flashing lights off the buoys that guide the ships up the river and keeps them off the sandbanks. So you've got flashing lights going off all over the place. You've got a town down on the coast there, Southend, which is in the background. Now that's, you know, brilliantly lit up at night with various, you know, houses and businesses and amusement parks and things. So you've got flashing lights on the buoys, you've got the backscatter of all these lights on the shore, and then somewhere out there is that unlit buoy, a small unlit, but they normally pick quite a hard metal buoy, so you really don't want to hit it, and they'll say, navigate me to that. Well, that's all about working out on the chart compass bearings, and also you need to know how fast you're going to run. So you don't want to run at it, you know, flat out. Now the boats we were using, some of them were capable of, you know, 45, 50 knots, which is kind of, you know, 50, 55 miles an hour. Doesn't sound that fast to a car, but on water, on a boat, that's incredibly fast. So invariably you would pick a speed, let's say 10 knots. and you would know that if I run at 10 knots for 10 minutes in that direction, I will cover X amount of distance. You now need to work out what that distance is to that buoy and what compass bearing I need to run at. But at night, it's quite difficult to keep a really good compass bearing with very few reference points. So you would actually have someone at the back of the boat as well, and you would tell them, you need to keep me on course with, you know, whatever the bearing is. And that way you had both the bearing you were following on your compass in the direction you were going, but you also had your pal out the back on the deck behind you who was following a back bearing to ensure that you hadn't come off that bearing, you know, without realising. And then in an ideal world, you'd know that, okay, at 10 minutes, at 10 knots, I am going to arrive at that buoy. So you've got that horrifying moment where you back off on the throttle and you've come virtually to a stop, and you're pretty confident that buoy should be right in front of you. So you come to a stop and you go outside and you're looking with your torch or your searchlight, and then amazingly, if you've been lucky and if you worked it out correctly, there is that small unlit buoy, and you're able to say to the instructor, it's there, that's it, you know. And they're like, yep, thanks very much, I'm happy with that, that's a pass. You know, it didn't always go as well as that, because you have to bring in weather, fog, you know, rough seas, tide, all sorts of factors can come into play. So it's quite a challenging part of the course, that, and certainly one that we dreaded as we got closer to it when we were on the course. So I'll just talk briefly about the boats we use as well. Now, again, this has changed a little bit, although I don't think much now, because these are such good vessels that they've stuck with them. Certainly at the time, we had about 4 different types of vessel. The main sort of everyday boat was a Targa, and Targas, I believe, are built in Sweden or Denmark, somewhere like that. Fantastic boats, really, really good boats. You can have a look. They call them the 4x4 of the sea. That's the advertising slogan. And I have to say, they are correct. You know, generally the crew of 3 would be on that boat. They had a couple of bunks on there. They had a toilet on there. You were able to cook. You could make a cup of tea on there. You know, they're really, really capable boats, but incredibly quick as well. And at the time, they were fitted with twin Volvo 310 horsepower. As I say, you could get on a good day about 45 knots out of one of those. So 50 odd mile an hour, 52 mile an hour. Very, very fast for a boat. You know, as I say, not necessarily impressive from a car point of view, but from a boat, you know, that's a quick boat. They're very, very expensive. At the time, I think they're about £250,000 a pop. And I think at one time the unit had about 10 of them. So it's quite an expensive unit to run, the marine unit. But we also had ribs available of different types, you know, smaller and bigger, ranging from about 6 meters up to sort of 12 meters for different roles. We had ones that had props on them, you know, i.e. propellers spinning on outdrives, which is like a leg that hangs down at the back of the boat. But we also had jet boats. So they spit water out the back in a jet, hence the name. They're incredibly manoeuvrable, and if you have twin jets, you literally can turn a boat on a sixpence, you know, and very, very manoeuvrable, although quite confusing to learn to drive properly. So there was quite a bit of training involved with those jet boats. We had a small single screw sort of fiberglass boat. They were called RDBs at the time. I think that was, I'm not sure what the R was for actually, but they were effectively your day boats, and they were the boats that were used prior to the Targas coming online. So they were great boats to cut your teeth on, and they kept a couple of them on for training purposes, and that's certainly what I trained on, because a single screw handles very differently to twin jets or twin out drives. They all handle differently, so we had an opportunity to have a go at all of them and train on all of them. So we became quite well rounded by the end of that course. Thoroughly enjoyed that 6-week course, managed to pass it, and was then able to go on to the team. And we're just coming to the end of this episode because I've seen the time again, but I'll just tell you about my first morning, because it was a typical morning in my career. For 6 weeks I'd been travelling to the base and carrying out this training, you know, knew the location pretty well, and generally I would travel in by train or tube or a cycle or something like that, and I was very well versed in it. But on the first actual day on my team working on the river, now that I was trained, I decided to drive in. Now, driving in central London is an absolute nightmare, but I drove in because we had a lot of kit to bring up with us, so I put it all in the car. It's not very practical to carry it, you know, on the tube. And first morning in, as I came out of the Blackwall Tunnel, I should have taken the left slip road that goes off and leads towards Wapping. Unfortunately, because I'd never driven in before, I missed my turning. And I thought, that's not a problem, I'll just carry on and I'll come off the next turning. Of course, central London on like a Monday morning was a total nightmare. It's gridlock. And as soon as I'd missed that turning, I realised the mistake I'd made. It was chock-a-block traffic everywhere, nose to tail. There'd been an accident as well. You know, from a road point of view, it was hell on earth, you know, and I just couldn't move. And I was a 7 o'clock start that first morning. I ended up rolling through the door about 10 o'clock in the morning. I didn't have my new sergeant's telephone number, so I couldn't ring to let them know. So they were fully expecting me to turn up. I ended up being 3 hours late. Now, I can't tell you how much stick I got for that. They were saying, you've been coming here 6 weeks, and you got lost, you know? And I was like, no, it's not like that, but it didn't bother. You know, there was no point in trying to explain it. You were going to get some stick no matter what happened. So the police banter came out again. Now, generally in the police, if you do something wrong, it's a cake fine. Now, cake fines vary from, you know, a few donuts for the team because, you know, you lost your handcuff key, right up to, you know, gattos for about 6 months if it's bad. Now, the worst donut fine I ever heard of was a colleague of mine in my previous force who'd put a taser on top of a car and then forgot about it and drove off. And unfortunately, somewhere in the half-an-hour journey he carried out, the taser had slid off the roof and went missing in a fairly rural location. They still don't know where it was because even though they put search teams out for 2 weeks, they never found that taser. It was just such a vast area it could have gone on. And I suspect it's still there now. Hopefully it didn't fall into the wrong hands. But can you imagine the cake fine he got for that? A few donuts wouldn't have cut it. Trust me, you know, that would have been gattos for about a year, I suspect. But anyway. So yes, Marine Policing Unit, that's me, all trained up and about to start. So next week we'll start with some incidents on the River Thames, and hopefully you'll find that interesting. Thanks very much for listening, and I'll be back again next week, normal time. Take it easy. Cheers. Bye.